That brings us to our main topic today on Mastering Dungeons 5e Revisited, Chapter 9 Continued Combat. Last show, we talked about Chapter 9 up to a certain point. So, in case you're joining us for the new year, what we're doing is going through the player's handbook and looking at 5e step by step in terms of game design, in terms of what's great about it, what might be lacking in it, how it might be changing with a new edition coming. And we're going to continue to do that through chapter 9 today. So chapter 9 is all about combat, and we left off with the section on making an attack. And I referred to this earlier in the show when I was talking about figuring out what a set of rules in a game, whether it's an RPG or any other game, figuring out what the rules expect the game to be. So when we get a whole chapter about combat, and the rules of this chapter are much more intricate and convoluted and mechanically complex than any other of the rules that we've sort of seen. We know that this game is telling us it's going to be sort of a tactical skirmish combat game. And so right away we get, how do you make an attack? You make an attack by choosing a target, determining any modifiers, and then resolving the attack through a die roll. If that die roll is a natural 20, it automatically hits. If that die roll is a natural 1, it automatically misses. Pretty standard, pretty simple, it seems like, right? Hey, you're rolling a die, you're choosing your target, you're adding a number. Seems pretty straightforward.
And
now let's get a little more complicated.
Well, and I'll add here that when we look at this determined modifiers section, it says the DM determines whether the target has cover and whether you have advantage or disadvantage. In addition, then special abilities, spells, things like that, other effects. But it tries to sort of put way up there, right? The DM determining whether you have these things. And I think that's almost my first thing that I would say is this is super elegant. This is brief and simple, but it doesn't do what other games would often do, where it would say, think about and encourage the player sort of think about what are the cool things you're doing and what effect do those have on the situation, right? This focuses it in a very narrow way and almost says like, well, the DM's making the call, but doesn't go back and say, why is the DM making a call? How do you get that advantage or disadvantage? What are you doing with your actions, right? It doesn't kind of get into that.
Right. And it also puts the focus of these decisions on the DM. Mm-hmm. Yet there are so many rules that it encourages these not only decisions but adjudications to be made by the player. Right. In third edition, we saw it drawn out exactly how you figure out if something has cover, whether ranged or melee, right? You see the pictures of the arrows going from the corners, and if there's only one corner covered, then it's this, and if there's two corners that don't reach, then it's this. And that's not here, but there is still this idea that I won't say that the game is telling it, but it sort of makes it so that there can be an argument, there can be a discussion about what is cover, what's not cover, and who makes that decision, if anyone. Mm-hmm. We have an elegant rule that then gets very, very complicated the more steps that you add, because the very next thing that is mentioned in the next header is unseen attackers and targets. So what happens if you can't see or be seen, if you're the attacker or the attackee? So there's disadvantage on attack rolls against targets you can't see. So you're trying to hit an invisible creature, you have disadvantage on the attack. When a creature that you can't see attacks you have when a creature can't see you have advantage on the attack rolls. But when you make an attack, you are no longer hidden because, as we talked about earlier, you have to actually take an action to
Right.
hide and be hidden. So you can be invisible, but you are not hidden unless you take that action to actually hide.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is a very interesting that unseen piece. It's almost like the I don't know, it's not that it's the worst, but it is amazing how you have this like, oh, it's all very simple, and you get into unseen attackers, and it's something that really took a lot of accomplished, long experienced players to go, wait, what does that mean? So wait, when I'm inside a cloud of darkness, and if no one can see each other, we're just making normal attack rolls. Because I can't see the target, so I have disadvantage, but they can't see me, so I have advantage. So those cancel out, so I'm just attacking. What is the point of darkness? And well, the point of the darkness, tactically in 5th edition, ends up being to cancel people having advantage on you, basically, right? To get rid of advantages people have, right? To get rid of sight lines, things like that. It's not as it would have been in previous situations where you'd sort of impose darkness on someone so they couldn't see, and then you'd gain advantage off of that, like some kind of advantage, right? And so that's very fascinating, and yet this is the book trying to be simple, but it isn't. It doesn't talk you through all this, right? It just states it's sort of it's fairly clinical as to how it's going around it, rather than being educational.
Mm-hmm. Then we get into the difference between ranged and melee attacks. With a ranged attack, you can only attack with weapons or spells if you are within the range of that sort of attack or weapon. Most weapons or some weapons will have 2 ranges. The second range counts as long range. So if you make an attack at a distance between the first and the second range that you're given, those attacks are made at long range and made with disadvantage, and you cannot attack beyond long range of a weapon or
Yeah.
spell. When you make a ranged attack, you have a disadvantage on the attack if you are within 5 feet of a hostile creature who can see you and who isn't incapacitated. That's whether you're attacking the creature that's next to you or you're attacking someone further away.
And this,
All right, I
we're
can
going to
see
see,
that.
Shawn. This gets into the topic of cover, and in previous editions where you have lots and lots of bonuses, 5th edition has tried to get rid of all those bonuses, but by replacing them with advantage and disadvantage. But now you end up with situations where the rules have to say like, ooh, I can't have a bunch of things that give advantage because now or a bunch of things that give disadvantage because then they won't matter. So we'll see that cover does not use advantage or disadvantage because it's trying to work with these rules, right? And not just stack in a way that isn't meaningful.
It's true. With melee attacks, most creatures and weapons have a reach of 5 feet. You can't attack beyond that reach unless you have some special ability or weapon that lets you. You can make an unarmed strike if you lack a weapon. This attack does 1 plus your strength modifier of bludgeoning damage, and you are always proficient with your unarmed strikes. An opportunity attack is mentioned here as a melee attack that uses your reaction, and you can attack a creature moving out of your reach. That attack happens right before the creature leaves your reach. Now, notice the emphasis here when you leave the reach of the creature. This means that if you are fighting a creature with a 10-foot reach, they don't get an opportunity attack until you move from 10 feet to 15 feet away.
Yeah.
Yet, if you attack with a ranged weapon, you can be within 10 feet and not take the disadvantage because that only says if you're within 5 feet of a creature. It doesn't take into account the reach of the creature.
Yeah, those are interesting choices. And I don't necessarily object to them, but there are some of the intricacies of the game, and the game's trying to be just complicated enough to have a few of these types of situations come up, but not so complicated that there are a bunch of them. And in that sense, I think the 5th edition succeeds pretty well. I don't feel compelled to I don't feel like I have to make a bunch of changes to this. Right? When I'm thinking of what would I want 6e to be like in my mind, like it wouldn't be the end of the world if it was just the way that 5e works. Like it's a pretty good rule set, right? There are some things I would probably look at tweaking and experiment with, sort of doing some alternate design, but not out of a sense of great urgency, I feel like. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I feel like we have in 5e a system that's simple enough to understand with a little either, careful reading of the rules or some play.
Mm-hmm.
It can be, and I am to the point in my gaming life where I want simplicity and story over mechanics. If I want a complex mechanical game, I will play a complex mechanical game and enjoy it. This this thing that we're seeing with 5e sort of pushes the boundaries that I want of too
Mm-hmm.
mechanical, because sometimes I feel like there's too much complexity for the sake of trying to make a complex game that's not really complex.
And isn't really accurate
Um,
or realistic
so
anyway.
right. So this is where the whole idea of a basic game and an advanced game comes to me
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over again. I want a game where I don't have to count squares or figure out where I'm standing, or do I want to either run up and hit the giant or stand back and shoot the giant, and I don't want to figure out where everyone else is or anything. I want this story to play out.
Yeah.
And I think D&D can be both, but not both at the same time.
Mm. That's
And I think
interesting.
that's what 5e continues to try to do, and it's succeeding just fine, but it can be better in both directions.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a simpler narrative game that meets certain people's criteria for fun, and it can be a more complex game that does the same thing. Um, I wish it would stop trying to do both at the same time.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. And cover, which is the next section, is a good example of that, where we have
Mhm.
half cover with +2 to armor class and dex. So there's sort of two things you need to think about. And then if it blocks 75% of the creature's body, now it's +5 to AC and to dex. And and that's sort of an interesting. And then of course you have total cover, where you can't be targeted by direct attacks. And that's the kind of thing that it's a bit complicated, right? It's these are things that you won't necessarily, many DMs won't remember, many players won't remember how to play off of this, and many other games resolve in far simpler ways. And so, does it help, to have that headspace, the cost of having to occupy this in your brain and maybe sit there and in the middle of a game say, well, okay, actually it's +5 benefit, or was it disadvantage? Someone might say like, no, it's a static bonus, and and you go through this only, maybe for the ranger to say, well, actually I ignore cover. If you've played enough 5e, you've been at some table like that where you spend all the time, you think, well, all this time could have been us role playing and enjoying and moving on. And so what's the impact of that, right?
Mhm. Yeah, this is one of those times where you say you run a game 4 times at a convention, and three of those times players are, I run up and I hit it with my sword, or I stand back and I shoot it. And then you get the one table out of the 4 where one player is like, well, I'm near this wall, so I'm going to shoot, and every round I'm going to drop prone afterward, and then I'm going to stand up as half, I'm going to shoot again, and I'm going to drop prone. And tactically it makes sense. Even story wise, I guess, it could make sense, but it just shows that differentiation between players when you see that wide variety of, how people use the rules
Yeah.
to, you know, to maximize their game mechanics versus the story that's being told.
The other thing I'll say about this, I think fifth edition, you can look at a lot of editions and say, well, how do the core rules play? And how does the game play, 3 years later, right? And so I would say, like, if
Mhm.
you look at fourth edition, I could almost say there's fourth edition core rules. Core rules. There's fourth edition with the Adventurer's Vault, which retooled magic items vastly and really changed how classes did and broke a lot of the barriers that the game had initially written for itself. And then there is how it played years later after you had all these different powers and features and feats and all of that. And the same could be said of fifth edition, sort of post Tasha's, right? And so what happens is when you have a game that initially just has a couple of pieces like what we're talking about here, that's not a lot of load. But you start adding all the other things that characters can do and that monsters can do and that the game is doing. And that's where these little things become, with all the little things become too much, right? They become less fun. And yet you don't know why, because in some ways it's fun to remember new rules, right? It's fun to think about the new thing. Oh, I'm playing an artificer and I have this turret. Ooh, well, great. What does that turret do? And that all feels like fun. But then you kind of think, well, wow, why did we only get through 2 combats this session, right? And why did it feel a bit like a slog? And then you think back and, well, we did spend a really long time arguing about all these little fiddly bits. So yeah,
not even arguing about them, just making use of them.
Yeah, making use of them. Sure. Right? Yeah. Remembering them and employing them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So then we go from cover into dealing with healing and damage. So it talks about hit points. And we've heard this discussion since AD&D days about what are hit points really. And 5e tells us that hit points represent physical and mental durability, the will to live, and luck. So that tells us how you can kill something with psychic damage.
Right.
Only, right? You've hurt its mental durability and taken its will to live. So we also get the quote, the loss of hit points has no effect on a creature's capabilities until the creature drops to 0 hit points. And this is something I've heard discussed a lot too, is how can you get hit 27 times with a club from a giant and be fine right up until you're at 1 hit point and you're still as strong and you still as capable, and then that next you trip over a twig, you fall down, you take 1 point of bludgeoning damage, and then you are suddenly unconscious and can't do anything.
Yeah
And it's part of the game.
It is. And I mean, I think if you play with systems that have all that extra stuff, different tracks and penalties and whatever, it starts feeling like the 5th edition exhaustion rules where you're like, I don't know that I'm having more fun because of this, because the game is somewhat.
It's a conceit of the game that I'm happy with.
Yes, I agree with that. Yep.
Yeah. Not that a different system would be wrong, but it seems like this system needs to be what it is to keep the game from bogging down with too much weight
and keep people participating, because
it is possible.
I was going to say, if you were less effective each of those 27 times that you got hit, now the game, you are participating in the game less, right? To some point you're getting all these disincentives to be active if you are at penalties, if you are going to be hindered further with just a single blow. And so it is the fact that it also works the other way, right? You can be unconscious and someone can heal you for a single hit point and you can come back and contribute, right? And that's a key to how 5th edition and other editions of D&D have often worked, that you just need that one little bit of healing and maybe we can turn the tide, right? That is exciting and fun too.
After hit points, the player's handbook talks about damage rolls. And to many surprise, it says that it is possible to deal 0 damage with penalties, but not negative damage. So I've heard some people say, oh, you always at least do 1 hit point of damage. That is not the case. If you have a penalty to if you have a penalty to your damage rolls and it goes to 0, you do 0 damage. There's another line in here that's also a little controversial, so I wanted to mention about damage rolls. If a spell or other effect deals damage to more than one target at the same time, roll the damage once for all of them. And so this rule, I think, was put in for area of effect spells like fireballs, lightning bolts, etc. But there are some spells that aren't area of effect spells where the same casting does damage to different targets, such as magic missile. And so this can be a little confusing because I believe Jeremy Crawford at one point said, even if you divide the missiles up, you still just roll the d4 once. And if you roll a 1, then it's 1+1 damage for each missile. If you roll a 4, it's 4+1 damage for each missile. You also have spells like that shoot beams that you could shoot up to 3 targets. I can't remember the spell off the top of my head. But that also, while it has different attack rolls for
Scorching
each target
ray
that you try to shoot with your Scorching Ray. Yep. Technically, by the rules, you just roll the damage once.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is one of those things where they're trying to talk about area of effect spells, but they don't mention specifically area of effect spells. So it makes other edge cases a little strange.
Yeah. What do you think about damage types? We get this long list of damage types.
Yeah, I mean, does the game benefit or is it hindered by too many damage types? How many is too many? Right. What do we have now? We have bludgeoning, we have slashing, we have piercing, the 3 sort of physical weapon damage, what we call in our game fighting damage. But then there's acid, fire, cold, electric, psychic, necrotic,
force,
radiant, force.
I'm
trying to think.
Thunder, lightning, very, very frightening.
Thunder, yep. Thunder. Yep.
Poison. Yeah.
And of course, thanks to Wild Beyond the Witchlight, we also have custard damage. Leading me to the question, should pudding damage be a default damage in 6e? Custard damage is fine, but if you have any dessert type damage, custard is too specific. So pudding, borrowing the term from British English, would cover all of that. Yeah. And I did a poll on this where the choices were yes, of course, or please leave Twitter. Yeah. And please leave Twitter barely lost to of course. So I want to thank everyone for that.
That's
allowing
fair.
Me to stay on Twitter.
That's science right there. That's a lot of science.
Yeah. So that's a question, and we understand why there's different types of damage. It works story wise because a lightning bolt would do different types of damage than a fireball would, and a mace would do different types of damage than a spear would. That all makes sense, and it also allows you to then give resistances to different types of damage. It adds a level of complexity to the game that some find fun, useful. But then is there too much? Does it become something more than what we need? I don't have an answer. I'm just asking.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, also you have the changes we saw with 1 D&D where they start talking about the barbarian, well, actually not even 1 D&D, where we look at Mordenkainen's, right, with its revised monsters that made it so now a lot of outsiders are dealing, what is they deal? Radiant damage? Force, right?
I think it's force, yeah.
Yeah, force. And so now, and the reason that's being done is so that they can hurt each other and not resist each other. But then what ends up happening is now the barbarian's no longer resistant to all of these different outer planar creatures because they normally can rage and become resistant. And so now they're not resistant. And it just, those are the types of interactions that just become too much, right? And you're trying to get to something simple, but I can understand that, if you try to simplify it to say something like elemental damage, well then I want to say that my fire elemental is different, and should it really resist all elemental? Because maybe it's cool to have it be hit by cold. But I think the thing is 5th edition seems to have a lot of language here for very little benefit. And I don't know, I don't have an answer either. I don't know how to make this work. I feel like other editions had a greater interaction going on where it felt like more often you were overcoming creatures' resistances and turning and exploiting vulnerabilities. Now it feels like maybe this is a lot of language, but it doesn't come up as enough. I don't know. Maybe that's just my games.
Yeah, well, I mean, that gets into the next thing we're going to talk about, which is resistance and vulnerability, right? Because having all of these different types of damage really doesn't mean anything unless you add the complexity of giving things resistance, immunity, or vulnerability. Resistance, of course, halves the damage, where vulnerability doubles the damage, and you can apply them, or you must apply them after other modifications to damage are made. Resistance and vulnerability cancel each other out. And so the question there is then, is there too much of this in the game? And does it become sort of a rote thing where because this creature has this vulnerability, we're always going to do that kind of damage to it? Or because it has this immunity or resistance, we're always going to have a way to get around that, whether it's an ability that a wizard has because of their school, or whether it's we're always going to have a certain kind of weapon at hand to make sure that we can get around these resistances or exploit these vulnerabilities. And when it turns into this sort of rote, we're always going to answer this challenge with this thing, and if I don't have this thing, then I'm not going to play, or my character's suboptimal. The game sort of expects you not to be able to solve all these problems, but players are generally able to solve all of these problems in a way that unbalances the game.
Or it just becomes, it loses its flavor. Like third edition had a lot more of this interaction going on, but it drove situations where the players so memorized what types of creatures had which kinds of resistances, to the point where, every melee character had a cold iron sword to fight fey creatures. And it was just this, so it's almost like it just became a meta thing and ceased to have any interest to it. It was just, I'll switch out to, weapon B, and on we go. And spellcasters would adjust when needed, right, accordingly. And but it wasn't flavorful, right? And so I think you have to be mindful of that, where if you make it too rich, well, then everybody weaponizes.
Yeah. So then we get into healing, what healing is. Obviously, healing is regaining hit points via either magical or mundane means. Mundane being taking a short rest and using hit dice, or taking a long rest and regaining all of your hit points. Magical being spells or potions or other magical items to give you hit points back. Is there, at this point in the game, too much healing, not enough healing, or just the right amount of healing in the game?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I feel like there is maybe a little less healing than I would like, but the game is not deadly enough also. So it's almost like characters are not taking hits that require their hit points generally being adjusted during play. So healing is less critical, and it tends to be that every now and then someone hits 0, so then you heal them, or someone's getting really low, so then you heal them. But that's not needed constantly, right? Like third edition was an edition where the big thing came up and hit you, and if all of its attacks hit, you probably went down. And so that was one of those bars go up, bars go down, right? Your hit points go down. The next round, the healer brings you back up. Then the monster brings them back. It was too much of a toggle, too much of back and forth. And because of limits in what a character could do, the answer was to constantly use healing wands, right? The wand of Cure Light Wounds was just endlessly applied to you to bring you back up every round, and you'd take your action and go back down. And that's too much, right? But I think healing is almost a little too underplayed. And it also comes at a sort of bigger cost and has a lighter value to where it doesn't see much use, and the cleric is often doing other things. I miss 4th edition, where there was a lot of this, I'm healing you and I'm doing this other thing, right? Character classes like the Warlord would do a lot of that You get a little bit of healing, but also this other interesting boost that changes the tactics of the situation. And
Mhm.
I miss that a bit. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah. I don't know. I think with third edition, what you were talking about was you only needed to have one hit point to do things. And there was more of resource management going on. So what would happen is the cleric would just get you to one hit point, but the cleric wouldn't want to waste their spell slots on you. So that's just keep you well enough to fight. Then when the combat's over, I'm not going to cast my spells on you. I'm going to use the cure stick. I'm going to use the
Right.
wand of cure light wounds. We're going to hit you 72 times with the wand of cure light wounds, because I'm not wasting my spell slots then, and we can continue on.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the question of healing goes all the way back to what what is D&D as a resource management game, and healing should match that goal. Right. If it is going to be a resource management game, then healing should be a part of that. I'm using a resource now. I will not have that resource later, which will make things harder. Or I'm going to save this resource now, so I might be able to use it later or at some other point, or a different resource. And I don't think the game quite knows what it is as a resource management game.
Mm-hmm. No.
So it's hard to adjust healing without knowing that. Um,
I
I
suspect. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
No.
I lost my thought,
Okay.
so I want you
I
to go ahead.
I I suspect that I like what the game is doing on this side of things, on the player's handbook side, on these rules. I think this is all fairly good. And while I'd like the healing classes to be a little more interesting, that part is probably working okay if the monsters hit harder. I think that's
Mhm,
probably just I think this is a good, simple foundation. It avoids all those abusive situations we've seen in past editions. But the characters are a little too resilient to where
mhm.
too many DMs are saying, I don't know how to challenge my characters. And there are other people who can. I don't have a problem with that, but and my players will tell you I don't have a problem with that. They'd stop being so mean. But for a lot of GMs do not know how to in 5e threaten characters, and I will say that in say organized play, there are far fewer deaths at my 5e tables than there are at 4e tables that I
Yeah,
play at. Right.
right.
It is the least deadly edition of any, and that's not necessarily
Yeah,
bad. I don't need to collect body counts, but the feel of excitement and of worry, of challenge and overcoming, and the reward of making it through is less in this edition, and that's where I think the rules, all these rules are fine by and large, and no major uphaul required, but the it's the damage intake, right, that I would like to see go higher,
yeah,
so that then these rules kicked in a bit more.
yeah. Well, let's go to the dropping to 0 hit points then. So, of course, when you're unconscious when you fall to 0 hit points, there is no such thing as negative hit points anymore,
Mm-hmm.
except you need to figure out how much overlap there is between the damage you took and 0, because if you take hit points equal to your starting maximum hit points by an attack, then you do die outright. Um, when you take damage when damage reduces you to 0 hit points, then there's damage remaining. You die if you're. I just said that. Uh, Death saving throws. A DC 10 saving throw, not a con saving throw, as some people have mistakenly done. It is just a saving throw where you roll the die. You don't add anything to it normally, unless you have a special ability. It's a DC 10. 3 successes, you become stable. So you're at 0 hit points, but you're not dying. If you fail 3 of these, you die. These counts reset when you regain any hit points or become stable. Now, this is a difference from third edition and from previous editions, where it didn't reset while you were in that combat. So if you had 2 failed death saves, you became conscious again, became stable, or regained hit points, and then you went unconscious again, you would remain at 2 failed saves or however many successful saves you had.
Yeah.
If you roll a natural 1 on these saves, It counts as 2 failures on a natural 1, or a natural 20 means you regain 1 hit point and become conscious.
And because you make that at the beginning of your turn, you
Mm-hmm.
can actually then do a thing, which is all very exciting, right? That's one of the most exciting things you can have is make a death save, you roll a 20, you get to act, and that's really cool.
Yep. And I have had more character deaths from failure of saving throws than any other kinds,
Mm-hmm.
than max damage, and basically it's because the players have turned this into its own mini game. Okay, this person's down over there, but they've got 3 saving throws, so we're not going to worry about that. And then they failed their first one. Okay, we still got 2, and then there's that natural 1 on that saving throw that gives them 2 and they die. uh, so I love that. It takes a little bit of the mystery
Yeah.
and adds it back into the game.
And the same thing with damage at 0 hit points, right? That's one of the things that when I think of like things that have killed characters in my campaigns, it's often been they can't get to the person, and the person's in, say, a trap that's going to deal damage again.
Yep.
And when you take damage at 0 hit points, you take a death saving throw failure. And if it's from a critical hit, it's 2. And of course, if you're down at 0 and someone attacks you, they can get a critical hit. So that's 2 right there. So it's very easy to get these sort of situations, and there can be a lot of excitement, but also that sense of, oh, we can't possibly save them in time, or those kinds of things, and then that can be hard.
Yep. And so that's a tool that you have as a DM. If your players are sort of metagaming and not worrying about down characters, just have the troll who gets 3 attacks take 1 attack against the unconscious character, just to remind the players that this is a game that you cannot
Yeah.
rely on the rules to save you sometimes.
And I think that's a great example of where there isn't guidance right here. So there are these rules. Nothing here is telling either the player or the DM how play should pan out, and when it should behave a certain way, right? But those are really cool tools you can use as a DM when you communicate, the murderous intent of these assassins, and that your downed fellow, well, they're going to attack them again next round. Now things are exciting. One of the most exciting things I had in one of recent campaigns was that clear communication that this person is going to kill your friend next round when they get an action again, and they get 3 attacks around, so they have 3 opportunities to kill them. And the heroics that took place to solve that were awesome, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also want to go back a second to this instant death roll, because this is something that in 3rd edition had a lot of teeth to it. People worried about it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And this really only is a factor at 1st level, maybe at 2nd level, some low hit points, because the damage that a monster inflicts, which is and this is just even the damage a monster could afflict, it's often below that value, is not very close to it's usually below the maximum hit points of a character by a good amount. And of course, your character's probably going to have some hit points when they get hit. They're not going to get hit at 0. They're going to get hit at 1 or more hit points, and they're going to take this huge hit, and that hit will probably not be an instant death, massive damage. So it's just almost a rule that just take this out. If it's only going to apply at 1st level, that's really the worst place for it to be. Let's just get rid of it.
Yeah.
Right? Like that would be an
totally
easy thing for me to do in 6e. Just remove this. There's no point to it. And I don't know that it's worth adding back in. It would require sort of retooling, and I don't know that we need the fun of the game. I don't think is the, oh wow, that hit so hard that I'm just dead. I think that's generally disappointing. Not, just have monsters hit harder, get rid of this rule.
Yeah, I would totally agree there. Now there is a rule for knocking a creature out rather than killing it, but this applies only to melee attacks. So if you hit a creature and knock it to 0 hit points with a melee attack, you can choose to say, I knocked the creature unconscious instead of killing it. But again, it's only melee attacks, not ranged or spell attacks. And so I ask, should it be harder to incapacitate a foe to make the game more interesting at the expense of the narrative? There have been so many times where my players are trying to, capture, subdue, but they don't have the tools for that. And so it
Yeah.
makes it, if not impossible, at least very difficult. Um, should they change that in 6E to just say, if you want to capture the creature, just say when it reaches 0 hit points, we capture it instead of kill it.
I like that a lot. Third edition had the whole subdual track of damage versus normal hit points. And that was sort of, you could apply a cushion early enough. I would often play a monk. So I'd deal always subdual. So anytime somebody wanted to take someone, there'd usually be enough damage I'd done that you wouldn't go over into death. They'd just go unconscious. And that was great. But it's another thing to track, and it's not worth the tracking. So I tend to side with what I think you're saying, which is just get rid of that of this requirement that it's a certain type of hit. Just say that when I defeat you, what I'm actually doing is the following, right? Like that's great. It could be pulling a blow, holding a spell, pointing at them, whatever. It doesn't have to actually. It's all abstract anyway, right? So let's just lean into that.
Yep. And then we learned about temporary hit points, which is Teos's favorite. Temporary hit points are hit points that are added on top of your regular hit points, and damage dealt to you is removed from temporary hit points first. Temporary hit points don't stack, so if you have some and you gain more, you just take the higher of the two rather than adding them together. I think, yeah, it's safe to say you aren't the hugest fan of temporary hit points in general.
I would be a fan of them. I think temporary hit points will play off of what we're saying, right? If you're in a game where bars are going up and down, temporary hit points become that really good cushion against your bar going down too sharply and knocking you out. That's why temporary hit points entered the game, right, as a real thing and became a more stable currency in the game, and part of its healing is because it was this additional other cushion piece that could help you and prevent you from the game going too far, spiking one way or the other. And now there are and initially in 5e it works okay too. It's not great because the monsters aren't very deadly, but it was okay because there weren't that many sources of it and they were pretty constrained. But now that you can have the artificer turret, the cleric that's constantly bombarding everybody in their aura with
Twilight.
and yeah, the Twilight Cleric. Any of these, like there are just so many of them, and there's so many features, and we see this in 1D&D as well. Well, the Ranger can give themselves temporary hit points, a bark skin. It's such a big pool of it, and the characters don't even need them. So why are we doing so much of this? One possible way to do this is to look at when they expire, right? So it used to be that temporary hit points would last not as long in some editions, and so you could make them easier to get rid of, versus right now it's the finish a long rest, and it's an all day affair, right? And so maybe if you made them last just a short amount of time, so they're really for a combat, that might help with its current form if you really want these constant temporary hit point bombardments. But I would just want to not have so many of them. I think the rules are generally fine. I just don't want them all over the place all over the time, right? Just unless the game's far deadlier.
I agree 100%. The last two parts of this section get into some sort of niche cases of combat, one being mounted combat, the other being underwater combat. And I've seen more complex rules, so I'm sort of fine with what they do. They say, willing creature at least one size larger than you that has the appropriate anatomy can serve as a mount. And as much as people love it, no, the barbarian carrying the halfling is not an appropriate anatomy for a mount.
It's a shame.
Hey, who am I to dictate what you do in your game? Once during your move, you can mount a creature that is within 5 feet of you or dismount. This costs half your speed, so sort of like standing from prone. And if an effect moves your mount against its will while you're on it, you must succeed on a dexterity saving throw or fall off the mount, landing prone in a space within 5 feet. If you are knocked prone while mounted, you must make that same saving throw to remain mounted. And then there's more about controlling the mount. I'm fine with very simple rules for mounted combat. I don't need anything more complex than that. unless we're going to make the game very complex and start doing really strange tactical stuff.
Yeah, these are. I mean, it's sort of like rules when they almost never come up. There are so few cases where characters end up mounted, even when maybe they should, from the logic of getting to a place quickly. They tend to not do that, and so these rules just sort of don't have much of a basis unless you do something like say, like, all right, everybody's on a flying mount, and now I'm going to specifically have this kind of a combat situation. The biggest thing that I think tends to happen is when DMs have a monster that is mounted and knowing what does it mean to be controlling it versus not controlling it. And so then you have to review that section. I think the rules are actually fine in play. Like, I don't have problems with them. It's just that it will require some review. I have a cheat sheet that I keep that I refer to for both this and the next section, but it's probably okay. I don't know that it needs to be a whole lot simpler. It's tough because you do want those situations where a monster benefits from it, and so you want to treat them a certain way versus just saying it's two monsters that are in the same square. You want a little bit more than that.
Yeah, and that brings up that point, I think, very well, is that anything the players can do, the monsters can do, and vice versa. So you don't want to make anything too powerful in either way, because then everyone is going to be riding a mount all the time and gaining that great benefit from it. Yeah. So the last bit is underwater combat. Pretty straightforward. When you make an attack roll, if you don't have a swimming speed, you have disadvantage on the attack roll, unless the weapon is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident, pokey things. Ranged weapons automatically miss beyond the weapon's normal range. And even if a target is within normal range, the attack roll had disadvantage unless it is a crossbow, net, or a weapon that is thrown like a javelin, spear, trident, or dart. And if you are fully immersed in water, you have resistance to fire damage. Congratulations.
That's why my characters walk around in water tanks.
Exactly. Just with legs sticking out.
Yeah. Wait, that's not fully immersed, Shawn.
That's true. Your legs would have to also have little tanks attached to them.
Why didn't we do that for Acquisitions Incorporated?
Water armor.
I'd like to recall the book.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I like
getting a little punchy here.
Yeah. I think those rules are great. I think my whole thing with underwater combat, this is not where the problem exists. I think these things are good examples of where it's fiddly, but probably adds good color and interest to it. What to me falls apart with any underwater combat is the guidance on generally how to make it feel like you're actually underwater and make that interesting when you're doing any kind of prolonged underwater scenes. That's the problem, not these rules to me.
I concur. And with that, we are about to stop this episode, which is very exciting to deliver to you as the first one of 2023. And we would like to thank you for listening to us ramble on about these things we love so much. And we would also like to thank our patrons who are keeping the lights on for us with their patronage.
Thank you.
We thank our Master of Dungeons supporters. We give in our show notes a special shout out to our Master of Realms supporters and to our Masters of the Multiverse patrons. You get a very special shout out right now. John Wilson, Graham Ward, James Walton, Joe Tyler, Krishna Simonse, Drago Russo, Falcon Neal, Eric Mengi, Adrian Marquez at Post Fiction RPG Audio, Travis Lee, Brian King, Sean Hurst, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Robin Dermy, Darren Chandler, Evil John, Steve Bissonette, and Craig Bailey. Thank you so much for supporting us. And you could be supporting us if you choose. If you do like the show, please consider supporting the Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. Also, if you get a chance, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or via whatever means you listen to this podcast. And if you listen via YouTube, please subscribe where you can see these beautiful faces every week. Exactly. Teos, where can people find you on social media?
Find me at AlphaStream at dice.camp on Mastodon. I'm still on Twitter, though not very active there. And the best place is really just go to alphastream.org. From there, you can reach my YouTubes and all the other endeavors that I'm doing. I've got a lot of fun things going on that are going to be announced this year, Shawn. I'm super excited. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin. There's also a podcast feed on Twitter at Mastering D&D on Twitter, and also at Mastering D&D on Mastodon at dice.camp. You can join our community and ask questions via the Patreon we already talked about. And if you listen via YouTube, you can leave comments on the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. Well, Teos, we have successfully taken the plunge into 2023 and the waters are fine. What are we going to do now?
I mean, we're going to be on our mount underwater, holding a crossbow right next to a foe that's behind cover while we are at 1 hit point. It's the only thing we can do.
But I am resistant to pudding damage, so I feel good.
Excellent. I'm going to have some pudding.